The maid who warmed the wolf princes. To lay a hand on the royal heirs of Ethgard was to sign your own death warrant. Every soul in the keep knew it. And yet, on a night when the wind screamed like something dying, a servant girl chose to break that law rather than turn two freezing pups away from her door. She had no way of knowing that the pups' father, the most feared alpha in the north, was already prowling the stone corridors above, following the scent of his sons straight toward her, a fortress in mourning. The winter of 1438 found the high keep of Ethgard draped in black. Mourning banners hung heavy and wet along the battlements, and a grief so thick it seemed to seep from the stones itself had settled over the courtyard. It had been only 3 months since Queen Rosalind of the Iron Fang Pack was cut down by rogue wolves in the Whispering Woods. Her death did more than break her husband's heart. It cracked the foundation the entire Northern Territory stood on. Alpha King Gideon, once unshakable, now moved through his own halls like a man carved from ice, and worse than his grief was theirs. His twin sons, Arthur and Zeo, left motherless at only 4 years old. Among werewolves, a pup's earliest years are shaped entirely by a mother's scent and warmth. Take that away, and something in a young wolf simply breaks. Without Rosalind, the twins lost all control of their shifting. They became stuck, half wolf, half pup, small feral things with matted golden fur, needle-sharp milk teeth, and a grief too big for their tiny bodies to hold. They refused every meal set in front of them. They snapped at the royal nurses who tried to comfort them. Their screaming night terrors rolled down the corridors and iced the blood of every guard on watch. Far beneath the nursery, in the soot-blackened belly of the keep, none of this reached the ears of a girl named Maeve. The girl in the scullery. Maeve was 19, an orphan out of the human village of Oak Haven, and her entire world was the scullery. The endless scrubbing of iron pots, the hauling of scalding water, the sting of Mrs. Gable's wooden spoon whenever a plate came out less than spotless. In a castle built and ruled by apex predators, a human servant without name or kin was simply furniture. Nobody looked twice at her. She slept in a narrow alcove tucked behind the great hearth, on a mattress gone lumpy with age, wrapped in a patched wool shawl that was the only warm thing she owned besides a crumbling nub of lavender soap bought once from a traveling peddler. It was a Tuesday deep in late November, when the order of things in Ethgard quietly came apart. A storm was clawing at the windows that night, rattling the iron frames until Maeve thought the glass might shatter. She'd only just dropped onto her mattress, her hands raw and bleeding from a night spent scrubbing the banquet hall floor with lye. The hearth fire had burned to a bed of dim orange coals, throwing long shivering shadows across the brick. Then came the scratching. It was soft at first, and Maeve assumed rats. The scullery always had rats. But this scratching was heavier, and beneath it ran a thin, high whimper that sounded far too much like something in pain, something that understood loneliness the way people did. She sat up slowly, clutching her thin blanket to her chest, and looked over the edge of her mattress into the gloom. Two small shapes huddled together on the freezing stone, roughly the size of large hounds, their fur a mottled charcoal and burnished gold. But no hound she'd ever seen had limbs quite so long, paws quite so large. When the nearer one lifted its head, Maeve found herself staring straight into a pair of glowing amber eyes. The royal heirs, the Alpha King's own sons. Terror seized her chest in an iron grip. The Iron Fang Pact was absolute on this point. No servant was to so much as meet the royal family's eyes, let alone touch them. If the guards found the princes here, filthy and shivering in a scullery maid's alcove, there would be no explanation that saved her. She'd be swinging from the courtyard gates before the sun rose. "Go!" she hissed, waving frantically. "You can't be here. Go on, get back upstairs." Neither pup moved. The smaller one, Zeo, though she didn't yet know his name, let out a broken little whine and staggered a step toward her, trembling so hard his legs could barely hold him, ears flattened against his skull. His brother Arthur planted himself in front of him, bearing tiny fangs in a warning that would have been fierce if his back legs hadn't been shaking just as violently. They were starving. They were terrified. And more than anything, they were unbearably, dangerously cold. Maeve's eyes flicked to the iron door leading up to the servants' stair. Every instinct told her to run for it, to scream for the guards, for Mrs. Gable, for anyone who could take this danger off her hands. But then Zio's legs gave out entirely, and he collapsed onto the frozen stone, tucking his nose beneath his tail with a sound so small and defeated that something in Maeve simply gave way. Gods forgive me, she thought, and slid off the mattress. She moved carefully, dropping to her knees so she wouldn't loom over them. Arthur growled, a startlingly deep sound from something so small, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she reached back, pulled the one warm thing she owned off her bed, and held the shawl out toward them. "It's cold out there, little lord," she murmured. "I've no royal silk to offer you, but I've got a fire, and I've got this." Arthur held still, golden eyes fixed on her, nostrils working. Whatever he found in her scent, wood smoke, lye, that faint thread of cheap lavender, it was enough to loosen something in him. He nudged his brother forward, and together the two royal pups crept into the ring of her shawl. To Maeve's astonishment, they didn't simply lie beside her. They climbed straight into her lap, burying their cold noses in the folds of her rough dress. She wrapped the wool around them with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, feeling the weight of them settle against her, their fur far softer beneath the grime than she'd expected. Within minutes, the frantic shuddering eased into the slow, even rhythm of sleep. Arthur rested his chin on her knee. Zio curled tight against her stomach. Maeve sat frozen against the brick wall for hours afterward, too afraid to move, fully aware she was holding a death sentence in her arms, and unable somehow to put it down. Just before dawn, the pup stirred. Arthur licked her soot-stained hand once, rough as sandpaper, then nudged his brother awake. Without a sound, the two of them slipped back up the stairwell into the dark, long before the rest of the keep began to wake. A dangerous ritual. Maeve told herself it was a one-time thing, a strange mercy born of a bad storm, but the scratching came back the very next night. By the third week of December, it had become an unspoken, forbidden ritual. Past midnight, the scullery latch would click, and two small wolves would pad into her alcove as though they'd always belonged there. They stopped hesitating entirely after the first week. They would leap straight onto her mattress, curl into the curve of her body, and tug the shawl over themselves with their teeth if she was too slow to offer it. Maeve began hiding scraps of roasted meat in her apron all day, feeding them by hand in the dark. Food they wouldn't touch for their own nurses. She brushed the soot from their coats with a comb she'd carved herself from a splinter of pine, and hummed the old lullabies of Oak Haven until their breathing slowed into real, unbroken sleep. Above her, the keep remained a battlefield dressed up as a royal household. King Gideon was fraying at the seams, holding his pack together through sheer will. His beta, a scarred brute of a wolf named Lord Corvin, quietly worked to turn that fraying into an opportunity, whispering to anyone who'd listen that Gideon's grief had made him unfit, that the feral state of the pups proved the bloodline itself was failing. Maeve saw the shape of that cruelty firsthand one gray afternoon, hauling slop toward the pig pens. She found Lord Corvin in the courtyard, screaming at a stable boy for saddling a horse too slowly. When the boy stumbled, Corvin struck him hard enough to send him sprawling into the mud. Lips split open. Maeve froze, bucket in hand, blood turning to ice in her veins. Before Corvin could raise his hand a second time, a vicious snarl cracked across the courtyard. Arthur and Zio, in their half-wolf shapes, had bolted out from the keep. Arthur planted himself between the towering beta and the crying boy, snapping at Corvin's boots, while Zio flanked him, golden eyes bright with a sharpness that seemed far too old for his years. "Control your beast, King Gideon," Corvin barked, stepping back, shouting up toward the balcony above. Maeve looked up. Standing there, watching his sons with an expression carved from cold stone, was the Alpha King himself. Tall, broad-shouldered, black-haired, with eyes like chips of winter ice. He said nothing to Corvin. He only watched. Then Arthur turned his head, and across that crowded, noisy courtyard, his gaze found Maeve directly. He didn't run to her. He was too clever for that even now. But his tail gave one small, unmistakable wag.
Arthur woke first, sensing another alpha's presence. hackles rising, and let out a sharp warning bark before wedging his small body squarely between Maeve and his father. Zio blinked awake a heartbeat later and pressed his back to her chest, baring milk teeth at the king himself. Gideon's ice-blue eyes widened. His own sons, heirs to the Iron Fang throne, were treating him as the threat, guarding a human scullery maid with everything they had. "Peace, little wolves," he murmured, and something in his voice had lost its usual iron edge. He lowered himself to one knee, bringing his gaze level with the mattress, and looked past his sons to the girl herself. "What is your name?" Maeve. "Your Grace." Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the shawl. "I swear on the old gods I didn't lure them here. They were freezing. I only meant to warm them." "I know," Gideon said quietly. The admission stunned her into silence. He reached out a broad, calloused hand and let Arthur sniff his knuckles before scratching gently behind the pup's ear. "I've tracked their scent for days. You hold no magic, girl of the scullery. And yet you've done what my finest healers could not. You've given them peace." He rose to his full height. "Tomorrow, you will not report to the kitchens. You'll be moved to the East Wing. You are to be my son's sole warden. If Mrs. Gable or anyone else questions it, tell them you act under my direct command." An unwelcome elevation. It was an elevation without precedent, and it sent a shudder through the rigid order of the keep. By noon the next day, Maeve stood bathed and dressed in heavy wool, befitting a royal governess, in a sunlit chamber hung with fine tapestries, a life she couldn't have imagined a week before. But the sudden change put a target on her back the size of the keep itself. Lord Corvin's entire plan hinged on Gideon looking broken and his heirs remaining unstable. A scullery maid undoing that in a matter of weeks, with the princes now eating happily from her hands and laughing as they chased each other down the corridors, was a direct threat to everything he'd built. Corvin summoned his closest ally, Viscount Reginald Hastings, a wealthy northern lord who held the pack's grain supply in his fist, and the two met in the damp cellar beneath the armory, surrounded by casks of aging ale. "The king is blinded by a peasant," Corvin spat, pacing the stone floor. "She hums a few tavern songs, feeds them scraps, and suddenly the council believes the bloodline is saved." Hastings adjusted his fur-lined cloak, eyes glittering. "Then we remove the peasant and the pups while we're at it. It should look like an accident, or better still, a tragedy of human treachery. If the maid is found to have poisoned them, Gideon loses not only his heirs, but his mind. The pack will beg you to take the throne to restore order." Corvin's scarred mouth curled into something ugly. "The solstice banquet is in 3 days. Procure wolf's bane, the concentrated kind. We lace the boys' ceremonial meat. When they fall, the vial finds its way into the maid's chambers." The solstice banquet. For 3 days, Maeve lived on a knife's edge. The royal quarters were warm and gilded, but she could feel hostile eyes tracking her every move through the halls, guards loyal to Corvin, watching, waiting. She never left the twins' side. She read them old human stories, played with them in the gardens, and little by little coaxed them back into holding their human shapes for longer and longer stretches, until one evening they shifted fully. 2 dark-haired, gold-eyed little boys. And Gideon wept behind a closed door he thought no one could see through. Still, dread sat heavy in Maeve's stomach as the night of the solstice banquet arrived. The great hall blazed with candlelight, velvet, and the low roar of 100 conversations. Lords and ladies from across the territory filled the long oak tables, and Maeve stood in the shadows behind the high table, eyes fixed on Arthur and Zio, seated proudly beside their father. When the main course arrived, a great platter of roasted venison, it was Lord Corvin himself who carried it forward, bowing deeply as he set portions before the young princes. "To the long life of the royal heirs," he announced, and the hall rose in a cheer. Maeve's years scrubbing pots and grinding herbs had given her a nose sharper than most humans possessed. As steam rose off the meat, cutting through rosemary and garlic, she caught something underneath. Sweet, earthy, faintly metallic, like wet soil laced with bitter almonds. Wolfsbane. Arthur was already reaching for his fork, smiling. No! The word tore out of her before thought could stop it. She shoved past two armed guards, lunged across the space between the shadows and the high table, and swept the silver plates crashing to the floor. The hall went dead, silent. Every wolf in the room was on their feet in an instant, eyes flashing, low growls building in 100 throats. A human had just laid violent hands on the royal table. "Seize her!" Corvin roared, his face a mask of practiced outrage. "The girl has lost her mind. She attacks the princes." Guards dragged Maeve down, slamming her against the stone, pain exploding through her shoulder. She didn't care. She twisted to find Gideon already on his feet, fury and confusion warring across his face. "My king! The meat!" she gasped through the weight pinning her down. "Don't let them eat it. It's wolfsbane. I smelled it." A desperate lie, Hastings sneered, stepping forward. "She means to humiliate your house, or worse, poison them herself and blame us. Search her." Corvin advanced, dagger already drawn. "Treason is answered with death. Human, you've overstepped for the last time." Before the blade could fall, a dual snarl split the air. Arthur and Zio didn't cower and didn't hide. In perfect unison, the 4-year-olds shifted, skin rippling into fur and muscle in seconds, until two half-grown wolves stood over Maeve's pinned body. Arthur's jaws closed on the wrist of the guard holding her down until the man screamed and let go. Zio snapped at Corvin's boots, driving the massive beta backward step by step. The entire hall gasped as one. These were children fighting with an alpha's precision, defending a human with everything they had. Enough! The word cracked through the hall like thunder. Gideon vaulted the high table and landed between his sons and Corvin, and the sheer weight of his alpha presence drove half the room to their knees. He didn't look at Maeve. He crouched over the spilled venison, closed his eyes, and breathed in slowly. Wolfsbane was bred to hide itself from a wolf's nose, but layer by layer, Gideon peeled past the rosemary, the salt, the blood, until he found it. A faint, bitter sting beneath everything else. When he stood again, his eyes had gone entirely black, the mark of an alpha at the very edge of his control. He turned that black gaze on Hastings, then on Corvin. "You meant to murder my sons in my own hall." "Alpha, no. The human lies. Corvin never finished the sentence. Gideon crossed the distance between them in a blur, closing one hand around his beta's throat and lifting him clean off the floor. Corvin clawed uselessly at the grip. "You questioned my grief," Gideon said, voice gone low and terrible. "You questioned my bloodline, but worse than either, you underestimated the loyalty of the one who saved them." A single, sickening crack ended it. Gideon let the body drop. Hastings collapsed to his knees, begging, as guards dragged him toward the dungeons. The fiercest protector in the keep. The great hall stood frozen in stunned silence. Slowly, Gideon's eyes bled back to their familiar ice blue, and he turned away from what he'd done, crossing the floor toward Maeve. The guards who'd pinned her scattered without a word. Arthur and Zio nosed at her gently, whining until she managed to push herself upright, cradling her bruised shoulder. Gideon knelt in front of her, the towering, blood-streaked Alpha King lowering himself to the cold stone floor to meet her eyes. He brushed a tear from her soot-smudged cheek with a thumb that trembled just slightly. "You risked the gallows to warm them," he said, and his voice carried to every silent corner of the hall. "You risked the blade to save them. You carry no claws, Maeve of Oak Haven, and yet you are the fiercest protector in this keep." He rose, drawing her up with him, and turned to face the stunned assembly of lords and ladies still frozen at their tables. "Hear me!" Gideon's voice boomed through the hall. "The shadows over Ethgard end tonight. This woman is no servant. She is the one who saved the Iron Fang line when none of us could. Anyone who disrespects her, anyone who questions her place at my side, answers to me." Maeve looked down at Arthur and Zeo, sitting close against her legs, tails moving in slow, contented sweeps. She looked up at the king beside her, no longer just a ruler carved from grief and ice, but a man who had found, in the most unlikely corner of his own castle, something worth rebuilding for. She was no longer invisible. From the freezing dark of the scullery to the high table of the Alpha King, Maeve had proven something the whole keep would remember for generations. That strength was never about the sharpness of your teeth. It was about the size of your heart.